You're listening to Two Babies in a Business, a podcast where Peter, my business partner, life partner, all of the partner words, and I discuss a topic each week that matters to us and how we're growing our business and our lives, and relate it back to all the fun things corporately, professionally, personally, and being parents too. And today there is a wonderful, friendly face joining us, Steve Osmond. He is a business coach at Rhapsody Strategies, but he is also our business coach, and we really feel and consider him a part of the CIPR communications team. Steve, you know this already, but I feel like Peter and I wouldn't be where we are in our business without you and your guidance. And as we talk about healthy conflict today, when you heard us announce that, I feel like you jumped at the opportunity to come and discuss it with us. So thank you for coming on today.
I'm really excited to be with you. It's actually really ironic that I would be enthusiastic about discussing conflict because I've had a very interesting relationship with conflict over the years. I'll get into that in a minute, but now I'm actually at a point in my life where I can say, yeah, I'd love to talk about conflict.
Nice. Yeah. Well, it's funny that you say that, Steve, because I guess I sort of want to introduce the topic and what you just said that is exactly me as well. So obviously we're here to talk about healthy conflict and the value it has on all things. But I, like you, Steve, probably, I'm guessing this is what you would say is I typically by nature am a conflict avoider. And then, so sort of avoid, hopefully it goes away. And then as we all know that often doesn't work very well. And the conflict will end up surfacing one way or the other, whether we avoid it or not. So, I mean, certainly meeting it head on proactively, I think is kind of the way to go. I think the reason we wanted to have you join us for this episode, Steve, is because, we've talked a lot about team building and obviously building our own team at CIPR Communications, but also the fact that every single time we have a new client, really we're building a new team. And I'll just say that in my experience, if we don't have a little bit of healthy conflict at the beginning of that relationship with the new client, as we know, there's sort of forming, storming, norming, and performing. If the conflict doesn't happen, that storming doesn't happen at the early stages where you can kind of, I guess, get a little naked with each other, get a little honest with each other, and sort of figure out how to get past those things early. Then in my experience, actually, those are the situations where the client relationships don't last because everybody avoids the conflict until it's too late, and then you end up being in a place where people just walk away as opposed to making the investment early and making it fruitful so that you can actually get to that norming and performing and really kind of build a strong cohesive team. So I think, for context, obviously we're talking about healthy conflict here in the context of kind of building teams. But obviously we're talking about it, personally and in all ways. And, I'll just say that, Steve, you're not only our business coach, but in some ways, and sometimes you end up being our marriage counselor and coach. So you've seen some conflict at the Pilarski house in all kinds of different ways. And I just wanted to thank you for helping us resolve some of those things, because I know that we're stronger as a result of that. And we thank you for your support there.
Yeah. So thanks, Peter. And just to follow through on your thought there, our conversation today, we're going to stay away from theory in terms of book knowledge or what does Google say, because really conflict and how we manage it, how we handle it is deeply personal. And the conversation that I'm going to be a part of with you today will include my personal growth in that. So theory is great. There are some books I can recommend, but as we all know, conflict is deep in our psyche in terms of avoidance or embracing it. And also it can be attached to many of our successes and failures. I would say in my personal and professional life, if I connect the dots back to successes, many times I would say it was because I handled conflict well.
Mhm.
And if I look at a lot of professional and personal failures, and I've had some ugly ones, I would trace that back to not handling conflict well, or having unhealthy conflict, which would include avoiding conflict as part of an unhealthy approach. So again, this is deeply personal for me, and my desire is for our listeners and for our viewers to really find some practical, real life assistance to help them engage conflict in the most healthy way possible.
Yeah. So I guess maybe, obviously, I said my deeply personal approach to conflict is avoidance. In fact, it's actually my deeply personal approach to most things. That's my personality as a 7 Enneagram. It's sort of avoid pain, avoid. What would be your sort of not preferred, your I guess your unconscious
Mechanism.
approach or mechanism when it comes to sort of facing conflict?
Yeah, I like to use the word autopilot. What's my default?
Yeah.
So I'm a 9 Enneagram, peacemaker, real strong emphasis on that. So pleasing, avoiding, harmony. So I will twist myself into all kinds of intellectual and emotional knots, like a pretzel, to avoid and please and to keep harmony, including changing the subject, avoiding the subject, using humor to alleviate the tension, yeah. So that is my autopilot. That I mean, even though I've been working through it for years, it's still my first reaction is to go to that autopilot.
Yeah. Maybe we'll just, while we're going through this little introduction, Christina, you're an 8 Enneagram. Conflict is something that I think an 8 Enneagram actually sometimes enjoys and embraces. So why don't you tell us about your autopilot when it comes to conflict, and how do you kind of approach that?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting, and I was reflecting on this as you guys were talking, because I am not and have never been someone to avoid conflict. Now, I think that it can be very good, especially now that I'm matured and have lived life. I think as someone who is younger, it comes across as, the bossy kid, or, the kid who thinks probably she knows best, but probably doesn't. So, I think it manifests its way in different ways. And I think now, where I'm at in life and what I've experienced, I know how to use conflict well. I think, though, that the majority of people, and again, this is not based on any facts, but based on my experiences, I think most people avoid conflict. And I look at, an Enneagram 8, and even so my disc style D, there is avoidance in there. And, my avoidance isn't, the same avoidance as the two of you, but it's about, putting the blinders on and charging ahead and not caring what people are saying or not getting another opinion, just going for it. So as opposed to coming in and having some healthy discussion and conflict, it's just going, whatever, here we go. This is the decision I'm making and I'm going for it. So, in times when I am avoiding conflict, which happens too, I do stop, but keep running, which causes lots of stress in terms of my relationships and people. And I think, early in the business, Peter, with you, I would definitely do that, right? I don't want to have this hard conversation with someone I'm trying to navigate with personally and now professionally too. So I'm just going to put my blinders on. I'm going to charge ahead. And, that's where you get into, okay, the finances of a company, and why am I bearing a burden there on my own? Well, because I don't want to have a tough conversation. But I think generally, like I said, I don't mind conflict. I think that it's a weird concept for most, though, too, right? Like, I think that I've had to learn over the years how to, and I'm still learning this skill, how to not come across as the one who's just conflicting for the sake of conflicting. I do love to play devil's advocate, but it's often not because I don't believe in the situation being presented, but because I want to see all angles and I'm trying to understand it. And sometimes that comes across as me now gloves off and I'm opposing the view, where it's more of let's do some storming. I don't know if you guys would agree with that assessment of myself, but
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would say I think your tendency sometimes is, and this is other language that we talk to Steve about quite often, is overperforming in sort of, there's a stressful situation, kind of so you'll just step in and, to your point, just sort of do to correct and whatever. And, that can sometimes not necessarily be the right approach either, because sometimes there's a need to slow down, have that conversation, explain, teach, whatever. And so anyways, that's just sort of there. But, so I think, obviously, the other thing I'll say is that I think societally, as Canadians, we probably avoid conflict as well. So that's just another layer of, we started with the very personal, but then as Canadians also, we have, interestingly, our US clients are ones that actually are a bit challenging for us, because they always say how nice we are and how accommodating we are, and they're much more blunt and more direct, like it's just culturally, right? And so, as an organization that works across the border, we have to then also be conscious about that, in terms of, the people you're dealing with have a completely different approach to it. I would say Americans are probably pretty assertive when it comes to dealing with this stuff head on. And again, being a little bit sort of general here, but there's sort of these cultural norms as well that are on top of it. So I mean, I think here in Canada we have this double whammy of just kind of kindness and avoidance and whatever. And sometimes I wonder if that serves us well. So I mean, obviously we've kind of talked a little bit about how our personal styles, our personal what we call autopilots. I'm curious, Steve, what your thoughts are on Kate. You see a conflict situation happening, you see your autopilot situation coming into play. What do we do? What do we do next? Where do we go from there? How do we get out of autopilot? Can you give us some insights as to
I want
you
to hear
handle that?
Steve's personal stories though too. That's
Well,
why.
we'll
Yeah.
sprinkle some of those in too. Yeah.
Yeah, I can weave those in. So Peter, I would say the autopilot adjustment starts before the conflict. So in advance of the conflict, kind of in advance of a fight in a boxing ring, or in advance of an athletic event, in advance of an athletic event, there would be some prep. And so there's 3 or 4 things that will help us in advance avoid that autopilot and avoid having a conflict event that we later regret. So the first one is to work on our belief about conflict. And most of us have a strong belief that conflict is negative. And I think it's always uncomfortable. I think that's a good word to stick with. It's uncomfortable, but it's actually positive. Because the best ideas emerge from really open, robust dialogue, as opposed to someone, just nodding and going along, and they don't really believe in the idea, but they're not going to say anything to keep harmony, artificial harmony. And so the best ideas never emerge. And so that's really helpful, a helpful role that conflict has. So the best ideas in every organization, every team wants the best ideas. That's what will separate us from our competition in business. We can assume that other businesses are avoiding difficult situations, difficult conversations. So if we as a company or a team embrace them, the best ideas will actually emerge from that.
And
so
I'm going to interrupt you quickly there and say, what's your, you have a saying, it's those who weigh in will buy in. Can you give us that saying?
Right. Yeah. In the training that I deliver, one of my favorite little mantras or phrases is that people who don't weigh in won't buy in. They don't buy in. So if they don't weigh into the conversation with, oh, I disagree with that, or I think we could do it better, or have you thought of this? Even though that might be that's gentle, that's not, throwing staplers at each other and screaming at each other, but that is a gentle pushback that is in that initial stages of disagreement and dialogue. And if your team is just nodding their head and going along with it, then you can be almost sure that the buy-in is not that deep.
Yeah.
Because they haven't put any skin into the game, any emotion into the game, any of their opinion or their genius or their ideas. So when they weigh in to the conversation, they're more likely to buy in.
I love that. I love that saying. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's really helpful when we look at our team. So if our team's too quiet, then we want to be inviting conflict. And some people say, can we use a different word than conflict? We can, but it's still in that
more dialogue,
dialogue, but it's still in that category of kind of disagreeing and pushing the envelope, whatever that might be.
And I'm just going to pause. I'm going to pause you there, Steve, and just add some color to that, because I think for some people, literally just expressing their opinion is perceived as maybe that's conflict, right? So like there's a big scale for people, and I'm always shocked by people where it's like some people, it's like, just say nothing, shut up, and to your point, like we've struggled as an organization, like we're in a much better place now, but as a new organization, it's like, well, Peter and Christina, you're the owners, you're the bosses, whatever you say. And it's like, and so it took a lot of work to get to a place of like, we want buy-in, we want people to weigh in, we want people to express because we buy into what you're saying, right? And so, but I think sometimes there needs to be an appreciation of the fact that for somebody even just to like express an opinion, sometimes they feel like they're like imposing on you, and it takes a lot of work to get past that. Yeah.
Well, and for a personality like mine, that's hard. Like you have to like first even recognize that, because I can be a bull in a china shop. So I think, right, like it took me a while to even realize that like the deer in headlights just doing this was maybe because they were scared to say anything, where I'm going, oh yeah, okay, everybody buys in, let's go, keep moving. So I think there's like this self-awareness in terms of like how you're coming across too. Like are you welcoming like I think there's a way for you to show that you're welcoming conflict and challenge, as opposed to looking for fake buy-in.
Right. Yeah. Artificial buy-in or artificial harmony. So just to keep on that idea of framing conflict as positive, not negative. So the best ideas come out of conflict. The best performance. So an individual will perform best if there's some conflict. If someone points out an area where you aren't delivering, or there could be some improvement, or an area where you've dropped the ball, and maybe a supervisor or a manager or a boss holds back from saying anything, and that person hasn't been confronted. There's been no conflict. And so now their performance stays at a mediocre level or a low level. So individuals who want to be high performers or want to succeed professionally reframe this idea of conflict to say, oh, if I have someone pointing out blind spots or pointing out weaknesses, that's actually a gift. That's a kindness to have someone tell you the truth.
Totally.
And start growing. So the best ideas, best performance, and then your best story. So the best story for your company and for your team needs to have conflict in it. If you go to a movie, or if you're reading a fiction book, a novel, the quality and the interest and the power of the story usually is attached to how interesting the conflict is. And and then there's this life is happening in the movie, and then there's this incident that happens, and there's some sort of conflict. There's a hero, there's a villain, there's an obstacle to be overcome, and the more compelling the conflict, the more compelling the story. And I think that's true for meetings and organizations and teams as well. If we want to have a really compelling story in our business, on our team, then inviting conflict, maybe even scheduling conflict, will help make our story more compelling and more interesting. So that's sort of that framing positive, framing conflict as positive. Yes, uncomfortable, but it's not negative. It actually has positive. Of course, there's always the risk that it could be negative when it goes into unhealthy conflict. So then it becomes, it could any number of destructive behaviors that destroy teams, destroy morale, destroy property, however extreme.
But I think even that kind of unhealthy conflict ends up happening, even if let's just say everybody's quiet at a meeting, nobody says anything, the boss is bulldozing ahead through, whatever. And then what happens is the unhealthy conflict happens then after the meeting, where then there's some rumors, and then there's some, what I mean, people talking behind the boss's back, and there's all kinds of like destructive behavior that happens. And so I think that, whether you want it or not, that unhealthy conflict is going to come out if you don't allow the healthy conflict to sort of actually, sort of lead the way, right? And just as you're talking, I mean, my favorite saying in life is that everything that has value in life exists outside of our comfort zones. And so, you talked a lot about just being comfortable with conflict. And I think that probably is, we all know that when we get out of our comfort zones and achieve something amazing, that's really when we get the most value out of life. I feel like conflict's probably one of those things. If we can get comfortable being into healthy conflict, we can probably feel a really strong sense of empowerment and a sense of accomplishment. And I think that's a really positive thing that you can get out of it if you could just get over that hurdle.
I think too, for me, Steve, what resonated with what you just said is, it's about caring. Right? When someone's pointing something out to you and willing to engage with you in that way. And for me, I think that's, I really, fell in love with Peter because he challenged me, and it was not something I was used to in relationships. I think that there was an intimidation factor and again, something that comes with maturity, but I like that discourse. I like to choose something out and, okay, what does this feel like and how's it doing? And, again, I think about different staff members and team members that we've had along the years at CIPR. And there's been something really magical and important happens when everyone gives permission to conflict. I think that, I've seen these moments in staff where they've been intimidated of conflict, and then all of a sudden, there's a productive conversation and they step into this place where they feel like they are welcome to do that, and their relationship with Peter and I transforms, their relationship with other team members transforms. And for me, there's all of a sudden, okay, it's my signal that they care more deeply about the team as a whole, as opposed to, person sitting in this chair doing this job, moving forward. It all of a sudden has become about the greater good, I guess.
Yeah, I like that. So the individual becomes more empowered. They grow in bravery and they grow in courage, and that affects many other things in their life, because as their bravery increases, as their courage increases, that helps every individual overcome multiple challenges, whether it's professional or personal. So celebrating when people step up, make comments, disagree. One tip to help make healthy conflict more accessible is to have conversation in advance in terms of what are the ground rules and practices that our team has when conflict arises. Many people don't do that. They just hope that conflict never arises, is kind of a wish. but it always does. It's inevitable. Even the most skilled avoiders, eventually, if they keep procrastinating and avoiding conflict, it comes out somewhere where maybe you've avoided it so long, and then finally you've had enough, and you fire somebody, and then you have an ugly final conflict. So to avoid that scenario, to prevent that scenario in advance, and we've done this with your team at CIPR, we walk through what are some ground rules, what's acceptable and unacceptable. Your team went through the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team. And of the 5 behaviors, the second one is conflict. So it's trust first, then conflict, and then there's some others. But we actually sat down and had a face-to-face conversation with your team around what's acceptable and not acceptable. Yeah. Is it acceptable to raise your voice? Is it acceptable to use strong language? Is it acceptable to have a meeting go beyond its scheduled end in order to resolve it? So, and when we do those kinds of conversations, we reduce the uncertainty. And that's one of the reasons conflict is so challenging, is because the more uncertainty there is, the more anxiety there is. Am I safe? Is this a safe place? Am I going to get harmed? Am I going to get attacked? Is someone going to swear at me? And so when we plan in advance, have conversations, and again, I mentioned there's a course that you can take to help with that. It's really practical. That reduces some of that uncertainty and some of that chaotic feeling, like, oh, this feels out of control. Now, it doesn't totally remove the discomfort. That's a fantasy. There's always going to be discomfort, but it brings it down into a manageable level that reduces the anxiety. I know one of the favorite things that we discussed recently in our team meetings is this big idea, this amazing idea that when anxiety goes up, thinking goes down. And that's part of that autopilot. We mentioned at the very beginning of the podcast, Peter, what's your autopilot? Christina, what's yours? What's mine as a 9? Enneagram as an SI in DISC. When my anxiety goes up, my thinking goes down, so I go into autopilot quicker. So if we plan in advance and say, hey, team, it's inevitable that conflict's going to arise. And when it does, here's our ground rules. And internally in our brain says, oh, okay, there's a plan here. They've thought about this in advance, and the anxiety goes down. It lessens. The volume is turned down on anxiety. And then that allows the thinking to go up, which is, again, thinking is that rational, conscious, being present, staying out of the autopilot. So for me, my autopilot would be distance myself from the perceived danger. So I get quiet, avoid, change the subject. So when my anxiety is lessened and my thinking, and I'm in my rational leadership mind, then I stay engaged. I disagree. And I'm able to push back or strengthen ideas with my opinion. So the role of a good manager, a good business owner, is to say, how can we reduce the anxiety systemically in the organization by planning in advance how we will handle it. The other pre-planning thing is to actually invite and not have it surprise us. For example, next week on Monday, we are going to be tackling this file together. This client, there's a lot of energy. There's a lot of disagreement around how we should handle this. And we're actually going to come in, we're going to roll up our sleeves, and we're going to not leave the room until we've come to a resolution on this. And so then people come prepared emotionally, and they don't feel ambushed by that. So again, in advance, there's some skills we could talk about. What do you do when you're in it? But many of those things can be avoided by framing a conflict as positive, and then also setting ground rules and inviting conflict. It gives more order and less ambushy kind of feel to it.
Yeah, I really like that.
I love the concept of ground rules. Sorry, Peter. Because I think this is where people kind of, I came from a workplace corporately that conflict was how we communicated. There was nothing other than conflict, especially kind of at my end of my time there. And it was not healthy conflict because there were no ground rules. I mean, there was a leader that, some of us would joke at the water cooler that it was like cage matches because, the two people who were conflicting the most that week would be thrown into a breakout room together and only the tough shall survive. And I remember one of my last conversations, especially, in my personality type, who's not afraid to have a scrap when I need to, coming in, and we both put our cell phones down on a table because we were both recording the conversation. And we were both very open about the fact that neither of us had any trust built, right? Like you're literally coming to the table and showing we have no trust. We're going to record this conversation because, there's going to be a he said, she said, or whatever at the end of this. And I love the fact that we walked through ground rules and that, we can continue to kind of lean back on those things. And I think, fundamentally too, having this core of trust and this foundation of trust allows you to have healthy conflict. And I think when we think about workplaces that, oh yeah, I have conflict all the time, but healthy conflict comes from a place of trust. And I think that was what was a game changer for me in terms of our conversations too. And, it's not just, I trust Christina at this surface level, but this kind of vulnerable trust that we're all in this together and we're all human and we're doing the best we can with the resources we have. I think that's where this kind of magic of like workplace conflict turns into healthy conflict.
Yeah. Just to summarize that thought there, was so powerful, Christina. But to summarize it, trust and conflict is related this way. I trust that you have the best interest of the company in mind, and I trust that you have my best interest in mind, that there's no desire to harm. And so if Peter and I are in a conflict about something, if I trust that he has CIPR's best interest in mind, then that alleviates that anxiety. And if I trust that he has my best interest in mind, he's not trying to harm me. If I have that level of trust, that really opens the door that we can be, we don't have our shields up, right? Our guard up, and it's like Peter stabs and then I stab back, and then it's like you said, it's a cage match.
I want to wrap it up with this thought for the purpose of giving you guys the opportunity to give this some thought, maybe. So one of the things I've been suggesting to Christina is maybe we make healthy conflict even one of CIPR's core values. And it was sort of like, oh wow, that's how would that be perceived? So anyways, I'll just leave that with you. Maybe we can have that conversation.
We can. So thank you, Steve. I mean, the three of us are going to keep talking, but thank you to everyone who's tuning in. Stay tuned for our episode next week where we continue this conversation with Steve. Maybe go this week, have some of your own healthy conflict, and meet back with us in 7 days. Thanks, guys.
Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Two Babies in a Business. To learn more, visit ciprcommunications.com or catch us on our socials at CIPR Comms.